A lioness knocked on his door. What happened next will leave you speechless. Dr. Allen stood frozen, a scalpel in hand, when the clinic door was struck with an unsettling thud. It wasn't the sound of a knock. No, it was the slow, rhythmic desperation of something or someone begging for help. And then, through the heavy, swaying wooden door, Allen saw it. A lioness. But not just any lioness. This one was battered, broken, and on the verge of death. She wasn't just an apex predator. She was a mother in labor, with a mangled leg caught in a deadly trap. Allen had no time to think, only time to act. What followed was not just the story of a doctor saving a life. It was a story of trust, survival, and an unspoken bond between man and beast. What would you do if something that dangerous appeared on your doorstep, helpless and in pain? Would you have the courage to help? Doctor Allen had been a veterinarian for over 20 years, but nothing had prepared him for the moment he opened the clinic door to find a wild lioness in distress. The clinic, tucked away at the edge of the savannah, was a place of refuge for injured animals. But this wasn't just any injured animal. This was a lioness, a fierce, untamed creature of the wild who had, for reasons unknown, dragged herself miles to find him. She wasn't looking for a fight. She was looking for salvation. Her golden eyes, filled with pain and exhaustion, met Allen's as she collapsed onto the porch. Her body was battered from the struggle, and the infection in her leg made it clear she'd been fighting for her life long before she arrived. But what froze Allen's heart was not just the severity of her wounds nor her wild nature. It was the sight of her belly. Distended, heavy, and dangerously low, she was in labor. The choice was clear: help her, or let her die. But helping a wild animal, especially one in labor, was no easy task. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and potentially deadly. Yet there was no time for hesitation. Allen grabbed his medical bag. His mind raced, but his hands moved with steady precision. This was not just a battle to save a life. This was the beginning of an unexpected bond between two beings from different worlds. The lioness's body trembled as she lay on the cold concrete, her breathing shallow and ragged. Allen moved carefully, assessing the situation with the precision of a seasoned doctor. But this wasn't just a typical injury. The weight of the decision that lay ahead felt suffocating. In his years of treating animals, Allen had never encountered anything like this. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew one thing: there was no room for fear now. "Mark, Sarah," he called out urgently, his voice sharp with command. "Get the emergency equipment, stat!" His two assistants rushed to his side, their faces reflecting the same mix of disbelief and worry. Allen gestured toward the lioness's leg, still caught in the iron grip of the poacher's trap. Her golden eyes watched him, not with aggression but with a kind of weary trust. It was as though she knew she was in the hands of someone who could help her, someone who had the knowledge to save her life. "We need to sedate her," Allen said, but as the words left his mouth, his gut twisted with uncertainty. A heavy sedative could be fatal to the cubs growing inside her. He couldn't risk it. The idea of using a local anesthetic crossed his mind, but the problem was far more complex than that. "Local anesthesia," he murmured to himself, adjusting his gloves, "but I'll need to be quick. We don't have time." As he approached her injured leg, the lioness flinched, a low, guttural growl vibrating from deep in her chest. The sound rattled Allen's bones, a reminder of the raw power contained in her body. But it wasn't an attack. It was a warning. "Easy now," Allen whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. "I'm here to help." The lioness's gaze never wavered as Allen knelt beside her, carefully working to remove the snare. Despite the agony written across her face, she didn't fight him. She didn't lash out. Instead, she surrendered. It was as though she understood he was doing everything in his power to ease her suffering. Allen's hands shook as he gripped the wire cutters. The trap was rusted, the metal sharp and jagged. With every movement, Allen could feel the tension in the air, the lioness's life, her cubs, and his very own survival hanging by a thread. If she panicked now, if she lashed out, it could all go horribly wrong. The metal snapped, the sharp crack ringing out through the silence of the clinic. Allen couldn't afford to relax, though. The lioness was still in excruciating pain. He worked quickly but carefully, knowing that one wrong move could change everything. Finally, the trap was free. The lioness let out a deep, shuddering breath, her body going slack in relief. But just as Alan began to exhale, a violent contraction tore through her abdomen. Her body went rigid, her muscles locking tight. Alan could see it now. The immense pressure of labor had begun. Her belly was tight, swollen, a telltale sign that the cubs were coming, but she was too weak. The labor, combined with her injury, had drained her strength. She couldn't push. And worse, the infection in her leg had left her with little energy to fight the pain. Alan's mind raced. He knew what needed to be done, but he didn't know if he could pull it off. There was no protocol for something like this. He would have to deliver the cubs manually. "Mark, Sarah, get the warm towels ready," Alan ordered, his voice filled with urgency. He moved to the lioness's side, gently pressing his hands to her abdomen. The tension in her body was palpable, but to his surprise she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch as though she was asking him for help. "Stay with me," Alan whispered. "You're strong." For the next few moments, Alan worked tirelessly. The lioness's breath came in ragged gasps as he carefully assisted her through the contractions. The first cub came with difficulty, but it was lifeless. The tiny body, limp and unresponsive, lay on the concrete like a broken promise. Alan didn't hesitate. He cleared the airway, rubbing the tiny chest with all the force he could muster. And then, against all odds, it happened. The cub took a breath, then another. The lioness, who had been watching him with a mix of exhaustion and awe, let out a soft, relieved sigh. She began to lick the tiny cub, her rough tongue tenderly cleaning the fur. Her purring, deep and throaty, rumbled in the air, a sound so gentle that it sent a shiver down Alan's spine. But there were still 2 more cubs to bring into the world. The air in the clinic felt thick with tension, but there was no time to dwell on the weight of the situation. Alan's hands moved quickly as he worked to help the lioness deliver her cubs, the room filled only with the sounds of her labored breaths and his focused movements. Her trust in him had been established with the first cub. Now they both had to keep fighting. The second cub came quickly, its tiny body wriggling in Alan's hands, but it was the third that would test his skill and perhaps his very resolve. The cub was breeched, its body twisted in a position that made it difficult for the lioness to push it out. With every contraction, Alan could feel the danger mounting. The cubs were already weak from the long journey the lioness had made. If he didn't act fast, the entire birth could end in tragedy. "Hold on," Alan muttered to himself as he carefully maneuvered the cub's body within the lioness. He knew the risks. Reaching in too far could damage her internally, but there was no other option. The lioness was exhausted, and she couldn't push the cub out on her own. Her growl deepened as Alan's fingers pressed against the delicate, tender walls of her body. Despite the severity of the situation, he remained calm, knowing that any sudden movement could spark the lioness's instinct to strike. But she didn't. She trusted him. She understood that he wasn't there to hurt her, but to help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Alan guided the cub into the world. The tiny creature let out a feeble cry, and Alan quickly cleared its airway, rubbing it gently with a towel. This time the cub breathed on its own without the need for resuscitation. 3, Alan whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. 3 healthy cubs. The lioness, still lying on the cold concrete, let out a low whine of relief as she nuzzled her newborns. The entire ordeal had drained her, but her maternal instinct kicked in, and she began to lick each of the cubs with a tenderness that belied her fierce nature. Alan stood back, giving her the space she needed. He could feel the weight of the moment, the overwhelming responsibility of saving a life, of helping this mother through an unimaginable ordeal. But there was something else too, something deeper. A bond had formed between them, one that transcended the boundaries of species. The lioness, the apex predator of the savannah, had chosen to trust him. Mark and Sarah, who had watched the entire process in stunned silence, exchanged looks of awe. They had never witnessed anything like it. This wasn't just the work of a skilled doctor. This was something different, something personal. Do you think she'll let us help her move?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alan shook his head. I don't know. But I do know one thing. She's not going to leave until she's ready. They all stood there for a moment, watching the lioness, now calm and content with her cubs at her side. The relief in the room was palpable, but there was a lingering sense of uncertainty. How would the lioness respond when it was time to leave? Would she allow them to move her to a safer part of the reserve? Or would she fight them, unwilling to trust anyone but the one who had saved her? All right, Alan said finally, breaking the silence. Let's give her a little time. She's been through enough. But as the sun began to set, a new question arose. How would this wild lioness, so full of strength and fury, react to the world outside the clinic? Would she ever truly trust humans again? Hey there, I just want to pause for a second and share something with you. If you've made it this far into the story, I know you felt that same rush of emotions that I have. It's not just about the lioness, it's about what happens when trust is built under the most impossible circumstances. And I want to hear from you. What do you think about that bond between Dr. Allen and the lioness? Do you believe that a wild animal can truly trust a human, especially after such a harrowing experience? I would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below. It's always so inspiring to hear from you, and your stories make these experiences even more special. And if this story has touched you, if you believe in the power of compassion, hit that subscribe button. So let's keep this journey going together. Thank you for being a part of this moment. Seriously, you're not just a viewer here, you're part of this community. We're in this together. The next morning, the sun rose over the savannah, casting golden light across the vast landscape. Inside the clinic, there was a palpable sense of calm, almost as if the lioness's presence had transformed the very air. Her 3 cubs, now beginning to stir and wiggle, were nestled close to her side. Their soft mews filled the room, breaking the silence that had settled in the aftermath of the intense birth. Alan stood by the door, watching them carefully. He had worked with countless animals in his career, but something about this moment felt different. The lioness, once a fierce and untouchable predator, was now a mother, tenderly protecting her newborns. It was a side of her that few, if any, had ever seen. The bond she shared with her cubs was profound, raw, and primal. Alan's mind raced as he considered what lay ahead. The lioness had survived the trap, the pain of labor and the exhaustion of her journey to this clinic, but there was still a long road ahead. She had to heal, and her cubs had to grow stronger. And yet, Alan couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, the feeling that this moment, this connection, was more than just a doctor saving a life. It was the beginning of something greater, something that couldn't be explained by logic or science. He stepped forward, careful not to disturb the lioness as she licked her cubs with gentle, precise strokes. The look in her eyes, though calm, still carried that wild intensity, a reminder that this was not a domesticated animal. She was a creature of the wild, untamed, fierce, and free. "All right, let's get her moved," Alan said, turning to Mark and Sarah. "We can't keep her here forever. It's time to get her back to the reserve." Mark nodded. "But how do we move her? I don't think she's going to go easily." Alan had thought about this for hours. He couldn't sedate her, not after everything they'd been through together. The lioness had been so calm, so trusting, that Alan didn't want to jeopardize that delicate balance. She'd already been through too much. "Let's try something different," Alan said quietly. "Let's not push her. Let's let her lead the way." They carefully opened the clinic's main gate, the one that had once served as the entrance to safety, but now felt like the threshold to freedom. Alan approached the lioness, his steps slow and deliberate. She looked up at him, her golden eyes soft but unwavering. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared awareness that something was about to change. With a slow, steady movement, Alan stood up and began to walk toward the exit, glancing back to see if the lioness would follow. To his surprise, she did. She rose to her feet, her massive form moving with surprising grace despite the exhaustion that still lingered in her muscles. The cubs followed close behind, tottering and stumbling as they struggled to keep up with their mother's deliberate pace. The 4 of them, Dr. Allen, the lioness, and her cubs, walked out of the clinic together, leaving the safety of the building behind. Alan didn't look back. There was no need. He knew the lioness was with him, just as she had been through the entire ordeal. They walked in silence, the vast expanse of the reserve stretching out before them. The land seemed to welcome them, as though it recognized the bond they had forged. The lioness, who had once been a wild creature of untold power, was now part of a new story, a story of survival, compassion, and trust. When they reached the edge of the dense acacia forest, Alan stopped. He knew this was where their paths diverged. This was the point where he would leave her to the wild, where he would relinquish control and let nature take its course. The lioness stopped as well, her body still and poised. She looked at Alan, her amber eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude, though that was part of it. It wasn't love, but it was something deeper, something that transcended species, transcended the very idea of what it meant to be human or animal. Without a word, she dipped her head, as if offering him a final gesture of respect. Alan held her gaze, the weight of the moment settling in. He had done what he could. He had helped her survive, and now it was time for her to reclaim her place in the wild. The lioness turned, her cubs following closely behind, and disappeared into the tall grass. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the savannah as Alan stood there, watching them vanish. What would have happened if he hadn't opened that door? If he hadn't chosen to trust in the unspoken bond between them? Alan didn't have an answer, but as he turned back to the clinic, he knew one thing for sure. He had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment that defied expectations and reminded him of the fragile, beautiful connection that could exist between all living things. In the days that followed, the story of the lioness and her cubs became the talk of the clinic and the reserve. Alan, Mark and Sarah had done their part, but it was the lioness's courage, her strength and her willingness to trust that made the difference. It was a reminder that even in the wildest of creatures, there was room for compassion and understanding. Alan would never forget the look in her eyes as she walked away, her cubs by her side, heading back into the wilderness. There was no gratitude in the traditional sense, but there was respect, a recognition that despite their differences, they had shared something profound, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The clinic continued its work, and the reserve carried on with its daily routines. But something had changed. There was a new understanding between man and nature, a realization that sometimes the greatest act of bravery is simply to trust. As for the lioness, she would never return to the clinic. But her story, her bond with Alan, would live on in the hearts of those who witnessed it. And it would serve as a reminder. In a world where we are often divided, kindness, trust, and compassion can bridge even the greatest of gaps. The savannah was her kingdom, but for a brief moment it had been his too. It had,